Today is Thursday, July 29th, 2004. This is the beginning of an interview with Mr. Robert Pennock. Mr. Pennock, who would rather be called Bob, is a veteran of World War II, during which he served with the United States Navy. From the period of
1942.
Thank you. 1942 to 1945. This recording is taking place, this interview is taking place at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Frederick Wallace. I am the interviewer. Mr. Pennock, as we explained, this is your story, and we would like for you to tell it in your own way. To tell us, to begin with, where you were born, what school you went to, and what caused you to want to join the military. And then take us to the date of your enlistment, to your boot camp training, and just give us your story, your experiences from that point on, in your own way. Mr. Pennock, this is your story. Would you begin, please?
I was born in Fort Worth, Texas. Went to high school at Pascal High School in Fort Worth, Texas, and attended the University of Texas in college. I'd had my legs operated on in college and was told I could not play football anymore, so I left college after my second year and went to the West Coast. I joined a professional football team out there on the West Coast, and what is important about that, in my opinion, is the last football game I ever played in was December the 7th, 1941 in San Diego, California. It was most unusual to be there at that time, at that night, how scary it was. Troops going up and down the street, turnout lights, going into buildings, rumors of Japanese troops landing. It was a scary night. Shortly after that, I went back to Texas. I went to Houston, Texas, and went to work in Brown Shipyard in Houston, Texas. In October of 1942, I remember very well, a parade going down the street. It was a parade for service people and so forth. A band playing all the martial music of our country. And I went right across the street to the Enlistment Bureau and volunteered. While I was in the office, the chief that took my application said, "You have enough college possibly to get to go to officer school." And I said, "Well, tell me what to do." He said, "Well, I would just go on and go to boot camp, and then they will work it from there." Well, I was sent to Great Lakes Naval Training Center in Chicago, outside of Chicago. And while there, it was most interesting. I met a lot of men, been thrown together for the first time in their lives. And the fact that I'd had a little military training in the National Guard earlier than that, I was made what they call lead man of the group. That would be marching us to chow and back and so forth. While I was at Great Lakes, while the training was over with, they gave you an application that you could fill out what you would like to do. I volunteered to be a deep sea diver. I volunteered to be a submarine man. I volunteered to be an air crewman, and was turned down all three. From the Great Lakes, I was sent to Memphis, Tennessee, where I went to school, aviation ordnance, and when I graduated, I was an aviation ordnanceman, 3rd class. Interesting, at this training base in Memphis, it was mostly mud to start with, because this was early in the war. Inside the compound of the train station was another compound, rounded, with dogs inside of it, And if you went to class in there, you couldn't take any notes in or notes out. But we went in there, and that's the first time I'd ever heard the word radar. And I went to radar school also in Memphis, Tennessee. After Memphis, I was sent to Lake City, Florida, and where my job was to fly in PV, which is a twin bomber. They're training pilots up in the front end, and they're training air crewmen in the back. And my job was to fly with approximately 4 air crewmen in the back, that if the gun jammed, done jam it. And we would take the cases of bullets that we'd take were all dipped in different colors, so that when we flew out over Jacksonville to shoot at tow targets, you could tell by who was the shooter by the color that went through the tow target. Well, if one guy got sick in that hot Florida breeze, the rest of them got sick. So I got up there and started shooting everybody's ammunition. Then after a short time, I started taking my own ammunition with a different colored paint. And I became an expert with a machine gun because I shot so much ammunition, because always someone got sick. So I shot their ammunition and I shot mine.
How many gunners were on board an airplane?
On this plane, there'd be 5, 4 in the back with me, and be pilots up in the front end. This was a twin-engine bomber, Ventura, made by Lockheed.
And this was for training purposes?
They trained pilots up in front, and they were trained air crewmen in the back for the fleet.
Yeah.
Well,
and you mentioned a tow target.
This was a white
Can
sleeve.
you explain that?
A white sleeve that would be towed behind the plane out on a cable way out. And another plane would bring this tow target by our plane, and our gunners would shoot at this big sleeve. And as the bullets would go through the tow target, if you hit it, it'd leave a color, so you knew who was a better shot
You
than the
know
other
what
guy.
gunner fired that particular bullet.
That's right.
Good, I understand.
Well, after a while...
But let me take you back a little bit.
Yes.
You were saying that you went immediately on December 7th when you got back to Houston, or to your hometown, I believe. Is that right?
No, Fort Worth was
Fort
my
Worth.
hometown.
Okay. My interest is what did you tell your family that when you say that you were going to enlist? What did they say?
Well, my mother and father were divorced when I was 4 years old, and I had been rather independent all this time, and I really didn't ask anybody. It was just my feeling that it was the right thing to do for my country.
Oh, I understand. Okay. And you were not married, you were single?
No.
Okay.
After a while at the Naval Air Station in Lake City, I got desperate to go overseas in combat because I felt like I was stuck there the rest of the war. I requested a captain's mass to go before the captain requested transfer to combat duty. The first time I went on board, you remember I'm only 22 years old, I remember I almost cried because they turned me down and really laughed at me for making this sort of request. Approximately 30 days later, I reapplied to the captain's mass for the same thing, and I have my official orders right here, which I'm extremely proud of, which was dated July the 30th, 1943, to the Chief of Naval Personnel, subject transfer to combat duty. I hereby request transfer to duty in a combat area. My reason for this request is I'm not dissatisfied with my present station. It's simply the fact that I enlisted in the naval service for the sole purpose of getting into some action against the Japanese. I can have no peace of mind till I accomplish that end. I have taken great pains to thoroughly qualify myself in order that I may be a real value to a plane's crew. I am a graduate of a Class A Aviation Ordnance course, Naval Air Technical Training Center, Memphis, Tennessee, with a mark of 90.3. I am a qualified airborne radar operator and an aero machine gunner. The order from the chief, signed by the Captain Albert Hanley, who was captain of the base at Lake City. And this is the reply. This is received in answer to Pennock's request for assignment to aircrew training, expressed the belief that the man could obtain sufficient training as such in his present situation. The commanding officer concurs with this belief and is further of the opinion that Pennock is now eminently qualified to perform the duties of an air crewman. Pennock's performance of duty while at this station has been excellent. The commanding officer is convinced that the basics request is motivated solely by an unusual sense of patriotism and a desire for first-hand combat with enemy. In view of the foregoing, authority is requested to make Pennock available for transfer to fleet air activity as a air crewman. So he made me an air crewman on the spot. It was interesting to get orders in charge of me, with me, transferring me from Lake City to San Francisco. Interested going across country. I ran into my high school football close buddy that I still keep up with, Leslie Hightower, on the train, and he was en route to also active duty. He was a lieutenant in the Air Force. When I got to San Francisco, I was there just a few days and was sent out on a regular merchant marine ship, and I was sent to I didn't know my destination, but I arrived at Espiritu Santos in the New Hebrides, which is very close down to Australia, down that way. This was a base repair unit for Navy fleet, so planes to come in for repair and get new equipment. I was there a couple of days, and they sent me over the other side of the island, which was an aviation overhaul and repair unit, which was about an hour's truck drive over the other side. When I was reporting in to my new station, I asked for a transfer. The officer on duty says, "What outfit are you assigned to?" I said, "Well, I'm not assigned to anybody." He said, "Do you mean to tell me that you're reporting in and asked for a transfer before you even report in?" I said, "Yes, sir." And they laughed at me. But it caused quite a commotion. Well, I was assigned to work on fighter planes off the fleet, put new machine guns in the wings and get them armed, because the fleet would come back and pick up new planes that they'd lost in combat. While I was out on a revetment, a couple of months, this would be July, this would be October. The Princeton came in and was looking for replacements.
I'm sorry, would you explain, please? You said the Princeton came in?
The USS Princeton. It was an aircraft carrier.
Good.
It was a CVL. It was the CV was the biggest one. The CVL was a cruiser that had been converted into a aircraft carrier, which was a very important part of the fleet. But another snafu occurred when I got these orders to go on board ship. They were looking for a turret electrician. Well, I know nothing about electricity. So after about 2 hours attached to the ship's company, I was assigned to this squadron, which was Torpedo Squadron 23 on the USS Princeton. Well,
Was this in accordance with something you requested?
now this just happened.
This just occurred, okay.
Just one of the snafus of the Navy. It just happened the way I told you. They wanted an electrician. I wasn't an electrician, so I did have a gunnery score. They had all that record, so they put me in the squadron, which is what I'd been wanting to get in all along. Well, about 3 to 4 days after we sailed from Espiritu Santos, we had a ready room in the stern of the ship, air conditioned. It was real nice. Had big chairs in it, just like the pilots had one forward. And we were going to make a strike. We were going to hit the target. The target was Nauru. Now, you got to remember when I went on board this ship, I failed to tell you, I'd never seen a TBF, or TBF Avenger they call them, or they're a Grumman, maybe a Grumman. There's a TBF and a TBM. I've never seen one all my time in the Navy. I'd always worked with twin engine planes or bigger planes, or the fighters in the revetment. Well, I went down on the hangar deck at midnight to find out how to get in this torpedo plane, because I'd never been in one. And I found out something. I'm 6'4", I weigh then about 220 pounds. And to get in this ball turret, you've got to understand that it's similar to the ball turret on a B-17. You get in it, and when the turret turns, you turn with it. You're inside a ball. Well, when I put both my feet up on this little stanchion, you had to pull a piece of armor plate up from below. Then I couldn't work the gun. So I devised a way at midnight that I'd sit on my right leg up underneath me, and then I could operate the gun. Well,
This was because the ball turret was designed for someone much smaller than you.
you couldn't supposed to be no more than, I think it was 5'8" and 160 pounds, and I'm 6'4" and weigh 220 at that time. Well, anyway, a couple of days later, the strike going to Nauru, and I wasn't scheduled to fly. You really have to understand how many, I think all servicemen felt at that time, that they really were, in my opinion, were patriotic, and I still believe in that today. Anyway, I almost was in tears. I know this sounds funny, that I wasn't scheduled to fly on this strike. Well, right before takeoff, one of the men got sick. I later found out why they got sick. So they put me in as a replacement. We'd had an intelligence officer come back to our ready room to tell us that on this strike in Nauru, to not use the machine gun, because every fourth or fifth bullet in a machine gun is a tracer that you can see, because the searchlights, the guns at Nauru were all synchronized, and to not use the gun. Well, when I got in the plane, this was my first time I'd ever been off a carrier, first time I'd ever made a flight in this airplane, and we're flying at about 10 or 11,000 feet, and then I found out something else. I couldn't wear my harness. The crew had a harness which fitted on your back, and you had places on the front that you would hook your parachute on. Now the pilot had a parachute that he actually sat on. Well, I couldn't wear the harness because I didn't have enough room. I couldn't wear my flight jacket because I didn't have enough room. And at 10,000 feet on a pre-dawn take, it's very cold. I never forget it. I wasn't scared at all until all the black smoke started coming up that I could see in the pre-dawn hours, which was anti-aircraft fire. Well, then I have to be honest, I did sweat. I wasn't cold anymore. Well, we went into it, the torpedo plane was also used at that time as a dive bomber. And we went almost straight down. Because flying in my position, I'm flying backwards and I'm looking at the tail of the plane. I felt like it was going to come over this way. And as we went in this dive down, a searchlight picked us up that I could have read a book. I turned my gun and started shooting. I don't know whether I hit the target or not, but the searchlight did go out. Well, we go back and land. We dropped our bombs. We had 4 500-pound bombs. And we went back on board ship, and I'd only been on board ship a short time, that I was called up forward to the captain's quarters. I said, oh hell, I really am in trouble. Well, when I got up there, they committed me for using my head, because evidently I did put the light out. And shortly after that, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the skipper of the squadron, of the torpedo squadron, lost a man. He had 2 radio men, so he moved the radio man gunner to the radio spot, and I was promoted to fly with the skipper, which was an Annapolis graduate. His name was Commander Martin T. Hatcher from Bedford, Virginia. We made approximately 33 strikes. We got credit for a heavy cruiser. We got credit for 3 airplanes. And this was the earlier part of the war that we made strikes on almost all the Solomons, the Marshalls, which was Anahuac, which later was used as the atom bomb place that we dropped the atom bomb testing. We went into New Guinea. We protected the landings for MacArthur making the landings in New Guinea. We flew in Hollandia. We were scheduled to go back to the ship. Many times on board ship we would go out on a routine, what we call an anti-sub patrol, and we would go out where you could not see the fleet. And of course, you remember that fleet's moving all the time, and these pilots were the best in the world because to be able to go out and fly a triangle and then come back to that ship who had been moving to other places was quite a thing. Well, the last strike that we were scheduled on was the island of Truk, T-R-U-K. At that time, that was considered the Pearl Harbor of the Japanese fleet. We flew 2 strikes. I flew 2 strikes that day, and on the first strike going in, the mountains, which I have pictures not here, but I have them at my home. The mountains were, we dropped, the guns were up on the mountains, and we had to take out the guns for the other planes, torpedo planes, to hit the fleet that was down below. And after we dropped the bombs, we would go in very low over the water to go out. Well, all at once I looked up and I saw these planes diving at us, and things happen so fast that you really don't know whether they're good or bad. But I saw the fire coming from the wings, and I had my gun on him because I didn't know who he was, and I started shooting, and he blew up, and there was another plane right behind him, and it blew up possibly because of the first plane. Well, we get back on board the ship, and my pilot, which I have from the Secretary of the Navy, I was credited with shooting down one plane on that date, and that was April the 29th. What I think is interesting about my story is what I've told you so far, and the fact that I went on board the ship in October of 1943, the USS Princeton, and it was sunk October 44. Now, I'd been off of it. We were relieved with a new air group, Torpedo Squadron 27.
Hold it like this. No, hold it up. Mm-hmm. Good. Go ahead.
We were relieved by Torpedoes 27, and say several months after we were relieved and went back to the States, the Princeton was sunk. You have to realize that on board ship there's a ship's company, an air group. I still belong to the Princeton Association, although I've never been to their convention, and they're still very active because of the fact that when they were sunk in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, there were more men killed on the cruiser Birmingham that came alongside trying to save the Princeton than were actually killed on the Princeton. But that's really my story.
Well, that's interesting. There were several places during your recounting your story that I would like to go back and clarify. You were talking about the number of strikes that you had with your pilot, and the pilot name was Hatcher, I believe.
Martin T. Hatcher.
Yeah. Could you give us more detail concerning that? What kind of strikes were these?
Well, they were mostly on airfields because you got to remember that was a time that MacArthur was planning his move back to the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And we were removing those islands that were closer to that those airfields for taking the Japanese out of the picture so that the troops could go up and land in the Philippines. We strike at Rabaul, Bougainville, Buka. All these are part of the Solomons, the Marshalls, but the majority of them were really attacks on Japanese airfields.
I see. And you were credited with how many?
One plane.
With one plane, you individually, but you were credited with how many strikes?
33.
33 strikes.
Yes.
And are you still in contact with the pilot?
He's dead now.
Oh, okay, I understand. Mm-hmm.
I'm 84, and that was the amazing thing. When I went up forward that time I was telling you about earlier in my story, first time I'd ever met him, because I'd only been on the ship a week, and he appeared so old, but later on I found out he was only about 5 or 6 years older than I was. But that was the difference in time. But I do keep up with one of the men. I had a fellow that I was very close to. His name was Louis J. Gonzalez. When I joined the squadron, and I'm out there approximately 10 or 11 months, there was a fellow in the squadron, and I was big, and I'll have to admit I was probably a bully. This guy was a whiner, by his name of Bomber, and I picked on him a lot. And I'll never forget Louis J. Gonzalez coming up to me one day and he said, "Now, Pennock, you're a lot bigger than I am, but if you pick on Bomber anymore, you're going to have to whip me too." And later on, when we lost a radio man, I recommended to the captain that he fill his place, which he did. So I've kept up with him.
And at the time you got the word that the Princeton went down, where were you at the time?
I came back, which was really interesting. I came back to Fort Lauderdale. I was attached, my orders when I came back after a 30-day leave, my orders were to go wherever Commander Hatcher went. And he was going to get a new carrier and go back to sea. But when we got to Fort Lauderdale, they made him aviation training officer down there. And they made me leading chief of the air crewmen, trained air crewmen. These planes went directly from Fort Lauderdale to the fleet, because this was the last step of putting crews and pilots together and they're trained before they went to the fleet. And I stayed there, and I was at Fort Lauderdale when the Princeton was sunk.
And what kind of a feeling did that give you?
Well, you have emotional feelings. I remember that I was on Liberty in Pearl Harbor when I got the word from the Shore Patrol that all people attached to the Princeton get back to the ship because you're being transferred back to the States. And I left things on board the Princeton because I was in a hurry to leave, and so part of me, things, I had a Japanese helmet, went down with that carrier. And you just have a feeling for the ship. It belongs to you. When you're on board ship, you never, when you're flying, of course you see it, but if you're not flying, you're in the catwalk, which is alongside the carrier, to watch them land or take off, because it's like a kickoff of a football game, of a big game. The pilots to land on these carriers, you just don't know how good they have to be, because the ship rolls and pitches, and they got to land between all that and catch. There's 3 cables. If you don't catch one of the 3 cables, then you hit a barrier, which comes up from the deck, raises like this, and then they run into the deck. Run into the barrier. But carrier life was really interesting. Another story that you should know about, how brave some of these guys were. We were at sea 2-3 months, and we found out one of our crew members just turned 15. He'd gotten into service, I don't know how, at 14, and we're at sea, and we find out he's only 15 years old. His name was Verdi. He was most unusual. He wasn't afraid of anything. So it tells a lot about America and about our young people, in my opinion, what they can do when they have to.
Where were you when you were separated from the...
I was separated from Fort Lauderdale to Jacksonville and was separated from there.
And what was the name of the base in Jacksonville?
Jacksonville Naval Air Station.
Naval Air Station. Mm-hmm. And what did you do after your separation?
I had met a man in the service, an officer, that I went... my job at Fort Lauderdale was most unusual. You got to remember, we're back in '44, and we were the first air group to come back. We had unusual privileges in Fort Lauderdale. We used to call it the Country Club of the Air, because my job was to entertain the VIP and outside of the air crewmen I was telling you about, and shoot ski. And I did a lot of shooting. So I was on a hunting trip out in the Everglades with Lieutenant Moore, who's very well known here in Atlanta, Fred Moore. He was handled the real estate for the Rhodes and the Haverty chains out of the Rhodes Haverty building. He asked me what I was going to do after the war, and I told him I didn't really have an answer. I popped off. I said, well, maybe I'll play football again, but I didn't know what else to say. And he said, how would you like to get in the furniture business? Well, I joined the Rhodes Furniture Company here in 1945, and then I went on the road as a manufacturer's representative in 1949, traveling Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. I've been very lucky in my career.
And you were with them until the day of your retirement?
I retired. I didn't retire until I was 82. I was active because as a representative, I had 9 salesmen, 8 salesmen plus me, so I could stay a long time, and I didn't actually retire until 82.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Did you take advantage of any of the GI benefits
Yes, I bought my first home
on the GI Bill?
on a GI Bill. Yes.
And did you go to school on the GI Bill?
No, I did not go back to school. No.
At what point did you meet your wife
Well,
and get married?
this is my second marriage. My first wife died, and my second wife, we've been married. My first wife, we had 1 girl. I've been married 40 years to my present wife, and we had a boy together, and then she had 3 girls, so we actually have 5 children.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm the luckiest, probably the luckiest guy you've ever met.
And you met your first wife
Here,
after you got out of the service?
Yes.
You say that you maintain contact with the people that you were serving with, but you have not attended any of the reunions. Yeah, is there any particular reason why you have not attended the reunions?
No, like I told you earlier, that was ship's company. And you don't know them. You know, you just know that they are a group that you worked with. But it was just like 2 separate armies, you almost say. They were there, they ran the ship, and we were part of the air group. We were attached to the ship.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That's the reason.
All right. In thinking back, what is the most memorable thing that comes to your mind? Think back over your experience in the military. What stands out in your mind?
Well, I think on board that ship, when you see the guys landing, you just can't ever forget that to make a carrier landing. Because I remember one time coming out of Pearl, we'd been back to Pearl, and that was an interesting thing because we stayed at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, which was really meant for a submarine cruise.
So when you say Pearl, you mean Pearl Harbor?
Pearl Harbor in Honolulu.
Okay.
And so coming back out, going back to join the fleet, we'd gone back for repairs. And going back out, a pilot that we all knew well was about the 4th plane to come on board, and I was flying with the skipper, so we were the first plane to land. And as soon as you get out of the plane, you come around and get down the catwalk, as I was telling you about, which is towards the stern, to watch the other planes came in. And this pilot, Ensign Laneri, I don't know where he was from, he got a wave off, and a wave off you're supposed to bank to the left. Well, he banked to the right, and his wing caught the island structure of the carrier, and he spun around flat, just flat as could be, and I'm on that side of the ship, and we can see it, and it hits in the water by the side of the ship, just flat. The 2 crewmen get out, but the pilot, he didn't get out. So you just don't forget that. That's why those carrier landings make an impression on you.
So the pilots who flew from the carriers, you think, are highly skilled?
They were only the best because you had to have nerve. When that signal officer told you to cut, you're about 15 feet or more above the thing. Your forward speed, you're at the tail end of the ship, and your forward speed takes you forward and you drop like a rock. It's a crash landing. That's what it amounts to catch the hook. But it's interesting.
Well, what words would you have to say today to young people about the military? Would you encourage them to serve in the military?
I really am glad you asked me that. I watch the news very, very carefully. It's hard for me to understand why that anyone could not back our military. When they're over there, they're over there. And I think these guys that join, I take my hat off to them. And when one of these guys get killed, it hurts. I always thought the Vietnam men got gypped. I thought it was most unfair. And I don't think anyone has the right not to back our military. That's the way I feel.
So you would encourage young people today
yeah.
to go into the military?
Well, I was recommended for a commission and at Fort Lauderdale, and I went up for the first thing, and there, according to what I was told, there was not an opening in that category, and for me to reapply in 60 days. In my opinion, if I'd have gotten that commission, I would have stayed in the Navy because I love the Navy that much. But the war in Europe was over with, so like a lot of people, then I was anxious to get out. Mm-hmm. But I wonder what my life would have been if I'd have gotten that on the first try.
But you are pleased with what you have accomplished so far?
Well, I love the Navy.
Well, this has been very interesting, Mr. Pennock, and I thank you very much.
Well, Frederick, I want to thank you because it's very easy to do it with Frederick Wallace. I certainly thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're something.